And I think that that's another nice thing about Crystal as a suburban city versus some of our other suburban cities is we're not yelling. Well, there was one meeting where that was happening, but we're not yelling at each other. We're not, tweeting behind people's backs, or there's not a lot of flares of emotions. Whereas, what I see things that are like happening in Orono or other city councils, and it's like, oh my goodness, I just couldn't imagine going home after a council meeting at 10 p.m. and just like going to bed.
We're rolling. We're rolling.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.
I am really looking forward to this because I spend a lot of time talking about Minneapolis to Minneapolis elected officials and candidates, and it's kind of grueling, and I'm kind of bored with it.
Well, it's time to go westward or northwest, depending on your geography.
Yeah. This is the Wedge Life Podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards. My guest is Forrest Eidbo he's a council member in Crystal, Minnesota, a small city to our northwest. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, and excellent pronunciation on my last name. Most people get that wrong.
Well, I did my research. I watched a campaign video you did for, what is it, like CCX? Is that what it's called?
Yes, it is. We love CCX.
I occasionally come across their stuff when they're talking about suburban issues. What's the vibe in Crystal, Minnesota lately? I've done a little bit of research, but I don't know what they're talking about on Nextdoor. I don't know what they're complaining to you about. What's the big hot topic right now?
Right now, like what's on the forefront of my mind? What am I writing angry letters about? It's a good question. I think probably the number one thing that you don't know about that is affecting a lot of people is our airport. So Crystal has a reliever airport. Its code is MIC. It's in my section. So Crystal is a charter city like Minneapolis, and so we have wards and sections. And so I represent the northern half of Crystal where our airport is. And MAC, one of the regional governments in the Twin Cities, has a new zoning ordinance that they're trying to put in, which in my opinion is quite poorly written, and it could restrict people putting solar panels on thousands of homes in northern Crystal. So
why would an airport zoning ordinance restrict people from doing solar panels? How?
Well, there's some debate about this, but some people think that it could be too reflective and it would put glare in pilots' eyes. However, obviously not all solar panels are like that, but some might. But there's no real this is the exact amount of glare that's too much, and so that's part of the problem is the ambiguity around it.
In Minneapolis, when solar panels and zoning comes up, it's usually well, you want to build a building that's 1 story taller than mine next to me. It's going to shadow my roof, and I don't have solar panels, but maybe I will in the future, and you are violating my rights by building a taller building. That's usually the Minneapolis version of the solar panel controversy.
Yeah, here it's just MAC coming in and drawing a really big 1 mile circle around the airport, and saying, well, you might be restricted in the ability to put solar panels on your house, or you might not. We don't really know, but we're writing it in the ordinance so we can enforce it maybe in the future. So we're working on trying to get that a little bit more dialed in. But otherwise, things are pretty chill up here in Crystal. That's kind of the vibe. I'd say one of the things that's nice about it is even though we're pretty suburban, we're very close knit. We know everybody here knows their neighbors, and in a meaningful way, not just like a hello kind of way. And that's something that I found out especially is true across the whole city when I was out door knocking this last summer.
So I did some research. I'm going to go through my research for the listeners because I assume you already know all these facts about Crystal. Crystal, Minnesota population, 23,330. Population density, it's about half as dense, half as many people per square mile as Minneapolis. Household incomes, a little higher than 77,000. A little higher than Minneapolis is 77,000. Property value is a little lower, so it's a little more affordable. What else? Pretty diverse population, though not as diverse as Minneapolis. Also, I went on Google Maps to look at the satellite. No sidewalks. No sidewalk. It's not an uncommon thing for cities around Minneapolis. No sidewalks. Can I take the bus to Crystal, Minnesota? How do I get there by bus or bike from Minneapolis?
Yeah, if you were going to take the bus, I think the 14 is probably the most regular and reliable route to come to Crystal. I also know that the 721, that also is a very popular route here in Minnesota, but in northern Crystal. However, I'm pretty sure it leaves from the Brooklyn Center Transit Center, so you wouldn't be able to actually get there from Minneapolis. So I think the 14 is your best bet, probably. And then I think we have a few kind of commuter express routes in the morning and evenings as well. For bike, I bike to Minneapolis all the time. Three Rivers, we don't have MPRB doing our regional parks. We have Three Rivers out here in the burbs. And they have a number of regional trails that connect into Crystal. Either the Bassett Creek is a good one, and then also trying to remember the name of it, but it's quite easy to get hooked into the Veteran Memorials Parkway and come to Crystal as well by bike.
So I assume being a Crystal City Council member is a part-time position, right?
It absolutely is. I mean, yeah, so like you said, the population of Crystal is a little over 23,000, which is about, I think, 10,000 less than a ward in Minneapolis, if I'm doing my math about right.
Also, it's about double the size of the Wedge. It's two Wedge neighborhoods.
So, yeah, I mean, there's we have 7 people on our council, so 6 council members and the mayor. And so, yeah, we all share the duties, and it's definitely a part-time position. So we have 2 council meetings a month, a work session a month as well, and then we each have like a commission that we're a liaison to as well. So there's about 4 meetings a month that we do, and then all of the other time researching, writing letters, working with constituents and stuff. So, yeah, we get about $600 a month for our part-time work. Yeah.
So I think that's less than they pay the park board here. I forget what they pay the park board here. Should it be part-time? Do you think that's appropriate? Like sometimes I think maybe we would attract better people, and I don't know how much time you're spending necessarily on it. Maybe I mean, if you wanted to, you could make it a full-time job in terms of how much time you spend on it. So
yeah.
You think it's appropriate that it's part-time?
I think it is. I think it's I 100% think it is. I do think that having that little bit of compensation, that stipend, is also necessary because it is quite a bit of time, and so having a little bit of cash to justify spending so much time on that, and then also just driving around the city, there are expenses as well, so it helps cover that. I don't think in Crystal it would make sense to have a full-time kind of council because we have really great staff that handles a lot of our work that I think some of the council members in Minneapolis take on. The fact that we have a professional city manager really helps as well. And we just, we don't have as much stuff going on as Minneapolis, so it doesn't quite make as much sense to have 6 full-time, $50,000 a year council members.
Right. Although in Minneapolis, we've been having debate about government structure. Have you been following that one?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. I have friends that live in Minneapolis. I lived in Minneapolis myself. Because you recently went to a strong mayor system.
Right. And so all the staff that used to be like devoted to helping the legislative branch do their legislating is now answering to the mayor, which causes complications in terms of like, I don't know if the mayor tells them no. I'd rather not. The council is kind of out there without any assistance to do their legislating.
Yeah, I think that's. I'm not a huge fan of that system because your mayor, the mayor is operating like the city manager, right? They're the executive, whereas here in Crystal, our manager is professional staff, right? They're appointed by the council, and so I think there's a little bit more kind of beholdency to the will of the council, if you will. It's not a political position. And I think that lends itself to responsiveness and kind of more collective decision making too.
So I think I'm going to play some audio from that video you did for
Great.
for CCX. I was surprised at your two priorities.
Two of my main policy proposals are, one, to improve transportation safety in our neighborhoods. We can reduce the number of accidents and close calls in Crystal. Two, Crystal's tax base is overly reliant on single-family homes, meaning the tax burden on working families is too high. I commit to creating a long-term plan to diversify our tax base to reduce residents' tax burden.
Okay, so you got one, transportation, and then you mentioned the single-family home thing. And the first time I listened to it, I was thinking, this is like a YIMBY argument. This is like, we should allow more density in our neighborhoods. But then I listened to it again, and it's actually like a tax-based argument. Like, so I don't know if you're like sending code language to people who are trying to build more dense, pedestrianized, transportation alternative friendly neighborhoods, or what were you trying to say there?
Yeah, so actually I've heard from people in Minneapolis that certain neighborhoods in Minneapolis are becoming kind of like this, but Crystal's 100% like a bedroom community. And so people live here, but they tend to work elsewhere. And because of that, most of our tax base is single-family homes. That means when our levy goes up, the people really feel the pain because it's mostly owner-occupied homes. We don't really have we don't have as many apartment buildings or commercial areas to share the burden of the levy. Because as you probably are aware, there's different tax rates for single-family homes, apartment buildings, and commercial. And so since we're mostly single-family homes, they really feel the burden. That being said, we do have land that many people, including myself, feel is kind of ripe for redevelopment or improvement. We have empty lots, vacant lots, underdeveloped lots in our commercial downtown area. And so a big kind of campaign push for me, and actually my opponent shared the same message, was we need to revitalize our commercial cores and our industrial areas to bring them kind of up to a higher level and diversify our tax base that way. That was kind of the argument. That being said, it's not because of code, really. I had a long conversation with our community development director about this. We actually have some of the most, I would say, progressive and liberal code out there around commercial development, especially in our big commercial development area. It's almost like if you want to come and do something, you can almost do whatever you want. We use planned developments and mixed use, and mixed use is 100% allowed in our very large commercial area as well. So it's more of just kind of trying to get people to come in. I've realized that ownership of commercial property and real estate is a lot more important than I'd ever realized. If most of your commercial real estate is owned by people that aren't operating there, or it's just kind of part of a portfolio, they're not really looking at, well, can we improve this real estate? Should we look at redeveloping it? Especially kind of where in the market where it is right now. And so because of that, some of our commercial real estate isn't really being developed. And then with I'm sure you might have found this as well in your research, the Blue Line extension is coming to Crystal. And we're going to have a station right in our downtown core. And I think a lot of the real estate owners in that area are looking at that as kind of that's going to be a cash cow in the future. So they're not going to sell or develop without realizing that improvement in the future. And so if kind of right now we've been stagnating, waiting for that to happen because people aren't selling at kind of the market rate right now. They will only sell or only develop at the market rate in the future once that improvement of the light rail station is there. And so that's kind of what that point was all about. And then the transportation item, the number one, that was not, when I ran, that was not something I thought was going to be like my number one issue, but it's the one I heard the most when I was on doors at community events from people. And that's because I think in 2017, 2018, I don't know exactly when, we did as a city, had a whole kind of review of all the laws that we had, all of the regulation that we had to try and reduce the burden on people and businesses. Kind of a little bit of a libertarian thought process. And from that came a restructuring of all of our intersections. in our neighborhoods and city-run streets. That resulted in, I think, about 20% of our stop signs and controlled intersections were removed, and about half of them were replaced with yield signs, and then the other half are now uncontrolled. And that didn't work out for a lot of the intersections. Became kind of problem intersections in the minds of the neighbors, and the city hasn't been, until the new council, hasn't been really interested in revisiting that kind of change in intersection control. So that's what that transportation safety, a big part of that is looking back and saying, well, maybe we shouldn't have made all these intersections uncontrolled, and trying to figure out how we can reevaluate that and kind of listen to the people that live around those intersections.
So maybe this is a dumb question. I feel very embarrassed for asking, but does an uncontrolled intersection mean no stoplight, no stop signs, just a free-for-all?
Just like two roads coming together and nothing.
With nothing?
Yeah. So, I mean, it works if it's really low volume, but there's a point where you have too much volume for that to work. Some would argue that we went the wrong direction at a few intersections.
I don't know. I feel like people, when they approach and they don't see a stop sign, will go very fast. And if both sides don't have stop signs, I don't know. How does something like Crystal's not a rural area? They are very close to Minneapolis. Is this a thing that we see in other smaller cities around Minneapolis? Uncontrolled intersections?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, Golden Valley has a number of uncontrolled. It's more for kind of less dense, cut off neighborhoods, so you don't have a lot of flow through or traffic trying to go through the neighborhood. Everybody that's really on those streets is visiting a house or lives in that area. So it's low traffic and lots of familiarity with that area is generally kind of where you see it. That being said, especially with the increase in deliveries and things like that, I think that there's been more and more issues surrounding that. But yeah, I mean, there's lots of the suburban communities from Golden Valley, Brooklyn Park, have uncontrolled intersections in their neighborhoods.
I thought you were going to tell me that your transportation priorities were like, I'm bringing bus lanes and bike lanes to Crystal, Minnesota. I thought you were going to be a radical or something. You're telling me it's just about stop signs?
I would say the number one is like just the basics, which is we should have some of our intersections that are uncontrolled be controlled. So like that's the basic. And then also looking at bike and ped infrastructure as well. Crystal, as you probably looked at when you looked at the map, is like a really weirdly shaped city. We have chunks of the city surrounded by other cities like islands. We have weird tendrils going out into Robbinsdale and New Hope, and we're also very long and narrow. And so what happens is we have these major roads like Bass Lake Road, County Road 42nd, and then 36. These are three major roads that kind of just cut the city off into thirds, and it's really difficult as a pedestrian or bicyclist to cross those, and so it really isolates the city. And those are all county roads except for 36, and so we want to work with the county to try and improve those kind of the safety of those roads, especially to get our city connected. And you don't need to get in a car to safely get from one side to another.
I feel like the last 10 years or so, we've made a lot of progress in Minneapolis on street issues. Lindale Avenue, which I live near in South Minneapolis, has gone from 4 lanes to 3, and we've added some medians. We've made some progress on bike lanes, bus lanes, stuff like that. I wonder if, I don't know how long you've lived in Crystal, but like over the last 10 years or so, or whatever time frame you've lived there, do you feel like you're making transportation progress in your city, or you need to start making progress?
Yeah, I'd say it's that's a tough question. So I grew up in the Crystal, Golden Valley, Robbinsdale, New Hope area, where it's kind of like one big community, even though we're different cities. I've been a homeowner in Crystal for only almost 3 years now. But since I've grown up, things have improved quite a bit, especially in, I'd say, Golden Valley. They've added a lot of bike infrastructure. They've added roundabouts to busy roads. They've done some road diets. And in Crystal, they've done a little bit, but a lot of how Hennepin County does be like the above and beyond improvements, especially in suburban communities, like adding like off-road trail, adding additional infrastructure and curbs than what's just basically required. It requires like a local match and a local kind of ponying up to improve that project beyond just the basic requirements. And Crystal, for like the last 10 years, has never been interested in adding any extra money to county projects besides what's the basics for maybe they'll do a little bit of a utility reconstruction or something extra, but especially when it comes to bike ped and slowing traffic, that has not been on the council's even radar as an option, because they've been very just focused on fiscal responsibility, which is important, but I think the last few years have showed that if we don't play the game, which is helping the county improve a little bit, then our roads end up looking what they are now. If you came to Crystal, you'd be really surprised that some of our county roads, like, they just keep adding asphalt on top instead of actually reconstructing it, and the curbs and the asphalts, pretty much the road's going to be above the curb just because they haven't done anything. So I think we have a new council in Crystal. It's kind of swung the balance a little bit, and I think we're going to see some better relationships with Hennepin County in terms of hopefully improving our county road bike and pedestrian improvements. That being said, Three Rivers has done a lot of great stuff too. Since I was growing up here, we have a regional trail that you can take to Minneapolis and Medicine Lake that never used to be there, and it's been really great.
Here's another thing that I learned, maybe the most fascinating thing from your website. So to set the context for people, you won your election, you got about 2,100 votes, your opponent got 1,500 votes. And one of the top issues you list is like, vote for me. Look at the terrible thing my opponent is about. Was a resolution. So the city council approved a resolution supporting Pride Month, and the mayor and one council member voted against that, which is, I don't know how that happens in the year 2022. And that the mayor and that council member endorsed your opponent. So my first question, how was that an issue in the year 2022?
That's a very good question. I was honestly surprised that when it happened, it didn't get more traction, like in the Strib or really anywhere beyond. I think the only place I saw anything about it was CCX Media. Thank goodness for CCX Media. Everything that would happen in Crystal City Hall would just die in a dark hole if it wasn't for them. But yeah, I really don't know. I can't answer that. I don't know how it's an issue, but it's honestly a big reason why I ran. Because when I saw that happening, I was like, all right, I cannot because I live in the district that the council member that voted against the amendment. I lived in her district, and so when I saw that she was up for election, that was really what kind of sparked, like, all right, I can't live in this district and have her represent me. So that's when I decided, like, I was going to run pretty much no matter what. I will say that my opponent certainly didn't share those same views, but I think he was more fiscally conservative than me, and that's why he was supported by those people. But I think on that topic, he certainly disagreed with them. I know he disagreed with the mayor and the council member. So
did that end up being like a decisive or important issue to people when you talk to them? Like, I don't want to support anyone associated with the people who voted against a resolution supporting Pride Month.
I think that the mayor and the city council member supporting my opponent certainly influenced some of the voters in Crystal. Because, I mean, we are definitely, I'd say, more conservative than Minneapolis, but we are definitely if you look at how many, the votes for, I think, like, a good judge in the 5th district in terms of how conservative a district is if you look at the vote totals for Ilhan. And, Northern Crystal voted very overwhelmingly for Ilhan. We're not going to vote for somebody that has those views or is supported by people that have those views. And I think that certainly influenced a lot of people in the election that he was supported by those people.
How do you still have a mayor who voted against a resolution supporting Pride Month?
Yeah.
How long has this person been the mayor? How did he end up being the mayor?
It was when he was elected. I think I was in college. I moved out of the area and I went to the U, but I think he's been mayor for, I think this is his third term, and they're 4-year terms, and he's got 2 more years, I believe. How did he become the mayor? That's a good question. I don't exactly know. I think part of it is when he first ran, the previous mayor was generally considered fairly kind of just very unpopular. I think that she had created a lot of personal issues in City Hall, and it kind of bubbled out, and so people saw that as dysfunctional. And the current mayor, when he ran, was kind of seen as a little bit of a steadier hand. And so I think that's part of why he ran. I think another thing that's important to put in context is Crystal, compared to even our neighbors in Golden Valley and Robbinsdale, we're pretty uninvolved community politically. I think that, the people here, I think a great example is for this seat, it was an open seat. So the council member who was the incumbent decided not to run again. Open seat. Myself and the opponent were the only 2 people who filed. There was no primary. There was just the 2 of us. In this last election in Southern Crystal, there was somebody who ran unopposed, just an open seat. And that was a vacant seat. Only 1 person filed. So she was brand new, didn't have an opponent. So I think that just kind of shows, we're not quite as involved as some of our other communities. And then also when he ran for re-election, he also had a very bad opponent, is my understanding as well. The mayor has run entirely on being a debt-free city and being fiscally responsible, which I think, when you compare us to Golden Valley, is right now is great. Honestly, I'm very happy to see that we don't have debt service on our balance sheets. It's worked out because of where the economy is right now. Have we missed out on some infrastructure investments because of it? That would be nice. Yes, absolutely. But I'm pleased to see that we are relatively a debt-free city. I'm not answering your question at all, really, but I have no idea.
No.
Yeah, but
There's a lot of good context there.
And I think also in the last about 4 or 5 years, Crystal has changed substantially in terms of its demographics. We used to be very much an older, working class city. We're kind of, a lot of those people are aging out, moving, and it's a much younger city. It's certainly a much more liberal city than it was 5 years ago. And I think that's part of it too, is where we are now is not where we were 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we had a code task force that was looking to remove stop signs because it was bad regulation. We're a different city now. We still hold a lot of the core values. Like, I think everyone on the council, no matter how liberal they are, still values the fiscal responsibility that we have as a city and is prideful in that. But then what happened with Pride and 2 years ago, I don't think would ever happen again the same way.
So is the demographic change driven, you think, by people who would like to live in the Minneapolis area? They can't afford to live in Minneapolis necessarily, but I can be very close to Minneapolis. I could pay a little less for housing. Is that what's driving it, you think?
Oh, 1,000,000% yes. I mean, you can purchase a house in Crystal for substantially less than Minneapolis and most of our neighboring communities as well, and still be 13 minutes from downtown. And so that's kind of what Crystal's always been. We've always been a starter home, a working class community, because our housing has always been cheaper than our surrounding communities. And I think people that are wanting to move to Minneapolis, still live in Minneapolis area, are moving to Crystal because they can afford it. And those people are very different than the people that moved to this area 20, 30 years ago that have now moved out of Crystal.
No sidewalks, though.
We do have sidewalks. We just don't have
on
a
the main
lot.
streets, not on residential streets. Right?
On some, so Are you? Yeah. So there's a number of our residential streets that are MSA, state aid streets, and those all have sidewalks. But yeah, I mean, for example, the street I live on, maybe 20 cars go on it a day, and so it wouldn't quite make sense to have sidewalks. Crystal, more people. I see more people walking around in our neighborhood than when I lived in Minneapolis. Albeit I lived in the Como area and in Northeast. I mean, people walk their dogs, people walk their kids, people go bicycling through the neighborhoods because it does feel very safe generally, and it is a very enjoyable way to walk around, even though there isn't sidewalks. I remember when we were looking at this house, my wife was like, "There's no sidewalks. How are we going to walk around?" And having grown up in the area, I was like, "Well, it feels weird because you're on the street, but it is safe, generally speaking."
And you talked her into it, and now she's dealing with no stop signs, no sidewalks. It's anarchy there.
Yeah, my wife's going to look at this and be like, "Wow, he doesn't even know me, but John gets me."
How are people reacting to the Blue Line light rail issue? I've noticed recently there are a lot of smaller cities with anti-transit resident groups opposing bus and rail projects. What is the reaction to the Blue Line? I know it's coming. It's bisecting part of the city near the airport. I looked at the map and saw that.
Great question. I'd say that's probably top 5 issues here in Crystal is the light rail, just because it is going to change a lot, but I would also say they've been talking about bringing the light rail to the intersection that it's going to, since I was in high school, really. And I think also part of it is Crystal is a very different station and kind of impact of light rail than Minneapolis or Robbinsdale. The way that the route is planned now on County Road 81 is really not that different than the original plan when it was going on the BNSF rail corridor. It's just moved maybe 30 feet into the middle of the median instead of on the side of it. And also, there's just really not that many land impacts as well. It's going down it's a 6-lane county highway it's going down, and it's really not like there's single-family homes that are being taken and communities that are being separated in Crystal. It's just not the same impacts. People are still concerned about it because of the disruption it may bring, because of the crime it may bring, and kind of these kind of more higher-level issues. But when I talk to people in Robbinsdale, or I talk to people, or I hear about conversations that are happening, along West Broadway, or I think, is it Penn that it's proposing to go up in Minneapolis or Pennsylvania? Or
I should know this, but I don't.
Oh yeah. Well, anyways, it's one of the streets that it's going to be going north in North, and when I hear those conversations, it's a lot more specific, a lot more visceral, a lot more of a kind of direct impact. It's like they're going to be taking part of my home, or it's going to really change, my community. It's going to be separating my community, changing like a cohesive downtown element. And we just don't have, it's just not the same in Crystal. That being said, there's a lot of people that hate light rail, hate public transportation, and so they kind of get hooked into that in Crystal. But I would say, yeah, I door knock pretty much almost every house in my district, and more people wanted light rail than didn't that I talked to about it. So, as I said, it's different in Robbinsdale, it's different in North, but here in Crystal, I'd say it's an issue, but it's a much more low grade issue, just because of the built environment that it's going into.
Right. Do you remember the St. Paul trash war?
Oh, I lived in St. Paul the first year of it. Are you talking about when they wanted to do organized collection? Yeah.
So I found this on your website. You speak against requiring residents to pay for composting, even if they already do it in their backyard. It feels like you're setting up Crystal for a composting war.
No, I want the opposite. So, so Golden Valley, our neighbor to the south, recently, not recently, it was either 2 years ago or last year, required every single resident in Golden Valley to pay a private company to haul compost curbside from their house. There was no opt out. There was nothing. They got the bins. Every single person got the bin delivered to their house. And it created so much negative emotions and negative thoughts that people were anti-composting. Even though they weren't anti-composting, they were anti the policy and they were anti kind of like the way it was done. But it created so much negative emotion around composting that kind of turned a lot of people off to it. And I think if I'm remembering correctly, I think there was somebody that wrote an op-ed in the Star Tribune from the University of Minnesota saying this is not how you do it at all. Like they got really lampooned on it. And so that was kind of it was a good intentioned policy, but ended up going the whole different way because it was just like, this is a one size fits all. Like, let's just make everybody do it. And I'm not a fan of that at all. I think that you can be more nuanced with policy and work with people where they're at instead of forcing everybody to get to one level. And so that's kind of what that was going towards. I'm also against organized collection because I lived through it in St. Paul and it was just such a mess. Yeah, I think it works great in Minneapolis because it's a government service. It's one company doing it. It's the government doing it, right? You're all doing it. You're all accountable to it, to the voters really in an indirect way. Whereas in St. Paul, it was like these companies weren't going and like fulfilling their contract. They wouldn't show up some days. And then the city had to enforce the contract, but the city wasn't really able to enforce the contract. And then it was just such a mess. But I think it was, out of a good place, but
I think the reason it went bad in St. Paul was they were trying to hold on to pieces of the old system. And if they had just like abandoned the whole thing and said, okay, this is a city service and we're not going to split it up into a million little pieces here, it would have worked fine. So are you against the way they implemented it, or you just think like St. Paul is just not a civilized enough place to provide trash collection as a government service?
I guess
they just like to burn trash in their backyards. That's how they will do it forever.
I guess I'm more against the way they did it, because obviously it might be working now. I'm not quite sure, but it certainly didn't work those first few years. Because the businesses weren't fulfilling their contract and they weren't able to enforce it. I think they had a similar problem in Robbinsdale this last year with waste management. Waste management had huge staffing issues and wasn't able to fulfill their contract with Robbinsdale, and ultimately they just had to cancel the contract. I think that's what they did.
Do you have organized collection in Crystal?
We do not. So we're the wild west, not totally wild west. You have to be a licensed hauler in Crystal, so you have to. There's only a certain amount of licensed haulers, and then any resident can choose to go with the licensed hauler of their choice. And then the hauler can only collect on set days, so it's not like we have trash collection happening all through the streets every day from 6 until 10 p.m. It's only on one day per the area, so it's like kind of organized. It's not like how it used to be like 20 years ago where every day of the week there was a trash hauler going down your street. But it's less, it's not, it's not like there's territories of trash collection companies.
So as I understand, the argument is you don't want a bunch of trucks going up and down your streets, not only just every day of the week, but just having that many trucks go over your alleys. It's going to do some damage. It's going to burn some fuel. It's bad for the environment. So am I asking you a controversial question when I ask you to come out one way or the other on how it should be done in Crystal? It's probably, I don't know if it's something anyone is even proposing there, but is this the way it should be done?
I will come out against doing it the way that St. Paul is doing it. If that's controversial, so be it. But I mean, I do understand the negatives of having, 3 or 4 haulers go down a street versus maybe just 1 or 2. However, I could talk to our public works guy and figure out exactly the impact of having that, but I don't know. I just had such a bad experience in St. Paul with my trash not being picked up weeks in a row. It's hard for me to support that. I think that having, if it were to be a government service or maybe like a collective thing where New Hope and Robbinsdale and Crystal all got together and hired a fleet of trucks and did it themselves, I'd be more in support of that, kind of more the Minneapolis model. But being beholden to a private company that's operating across the metro for a really vital service, and then the only enforcement mechanism is trying to enforce a contract that could take weeks or months to enforce, all while trash is piling up. It's just, I think it's a risky proposition.
I didn't think we were going to get into trash war. I actually just wanted to ask a composting question. It was mostly a joke question. I didn't think we'd have this serious conversation about it.
I didn't think that would happen either.
Yeah, I really put you on the spot there. What's going on with crime in Crystal? It is all anyone wants to talk about in Minneapolis. Maybe not so much. It is getting better. I feel like we came out of the pandemic, and like, of course, this global catastrophe was going to have an impact on the social fabric. Of course, it was. And then we had George Floyd's murder, and debates about whether the police were going to exist anymore, and things got twisted, and it was a very terrible, stupid debate in a lot of ways that followed the murder of George Floyd. So that's my long-winded way of asking you, how are things in Crystal? You're not far from Minneapolis.
No, we're not. So it sounded like you read my website, so you probably know a little bit of my answer to this, but yeah, crime in Crystal's relative, especially to our surrounding suburban communities, quite good. It's been quite good, relatively speaking, for the last few years. While some of our other communities have really suffered from, understaffed, bad community relations, a whole host of issues with their police departments, Crystal really hasn't had that. I really kind of accredit that to our current chief, Chief Stephanie Revering. She has been a really kind of steady force in Crystal around policing, around community engagement in policing. And, Crystal's had controversies, we've had problems, but through it all, I think that we've really come out ahead, especially when you compare us to, Golden Valley, Robbinsdale. I mean, we have pretty much a fully staffed police department, which is a rare thing to say these days in Minnesota.
How many officers do you have?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head.
You don't know? Do you know, like, roughly how many?
I don't want to say and then be wrong.
Just estimate it to the nearest 20. I'm not trying to get you. I'm just curious.
I think we probably have around. I'm thinking I've been in the bullpen area where the patrol officers sit. I imagine there's probably around 18.
Okay. At
least desk spaces for patrol officers.
Pretty small.
Yeah, I mean relative to Minneapolis, very small. But yeah, so and then I think we have like 3 or 4 investigators, and we share some services with New Hope, like animal services, and we also have a embedded social worker who does follow-up services for police calls as well. We used to share that with New Hope and Robbinsdale, and then we shared it with just Robbinsdale. Now we have our own, and that's been very successful as well. Yeah, I'd say a big thing is when I was out in the community knocking doors, I really thought that police issues, crime issues were going to be a really tough subject. But to be quite frank, most of the people in Crystal that I've talked to from broad communities do trust Crystal Police in a way that I'm quite proud to say that that's the case. Our police department does a really intentional work embedding themselves in the community, going to community events, reaching out to our kind of more minority communities, and yeah, I've been really impressed, honestly. And I think the stats also show that they're doing a good job as well, because we are, relatively statistically less crime than our neighboring communities.
Do you feel, has there been a move to like enact more? You talked about the social worker, but like, has there been any push to enact police additional police accountability, or has that been a topic at all, or it's pretty much like things seem fine, the chief is doing a good job, we're not no reason to make any changes?
Yeah, I think right now things are going pretty well, and so we haven't really had any of those discussions. We have a multicultural advisory commission to the police department that's very active and kind of like it's not like a police oversight board. It's more of it's kind of more on the side, so it interfaces with the police department instead of oversees them. And that's been a really important vehicle, and that's been around for a number of years, and it's been very successful. I think kind of what's been going on has been working from what we can tell, and so there hasn't been any discussions on changing it.
So how long have you been on the job?
I started in January of this year.
Okay, so not very long. Do you feel like
No.
you've learned anything? Do you have any wisdom, something you did not expect when you started running and during your campaign? They're like, okay, this is interesting. Share some wisdom.
I guess the one wisdom is I wasn't expecting the number of phone calls that I would get and just how much time phone calls take. Everybody wants to talk to you on the phone, and since it's a part-time position, I have a full-time job during the day. It's really difficult to just respond to everybody on the phone. And so,
Do you have a work cell phone?
do I have a work cell phone? I do not have.
Yeah,
a work cell phone.
I mean your city council.
Oh.
Like, do you have a city council cell phone so they're not all coming to your personal phone?
I have a Google. So this is a real word of wisdom. Even if you don't think it's going to be a big to do, you're in a suburban community, you're smaller community, you're like, oh, I don't need a special phone number. I'll just use mine. Set up a Google Voice number, because I did that later in my campaign, and there's a number of people who have my personal phone number and they use it. But otherwise, I do have a Google Voice number now that kind of screens some of the calls and allows me to not just have my phone ringing all the time.
So the constituents who call you on the phone have your number from the campaign. And so, like, it's not on a city website somewhere. Call Forrest, your council member. That there's no phone number for your office, is there?
There is. It's my Google Voice number, and so it does go to my phone. But
So
but
you're
don't-
just on your own to figure out how you're going to do the whole phone thing. Do other council members also have phone numbers listed, or it's optional?
Yeah, pretty much everybody just uses Google Voice. Everyone
Okay.
has that.
Is that a thing that's in the orientation handbook when you get elected?
No, but it's something I found out talking to a current city council member. Yeah, it's just I think it's it's just us. When you email or you call, it's just me, and and that was one thing too. Is when I first moved here, I had some issues, and I emailed the city council member. Never got a response. I respond to every email because I think it matters. Regardless if I agree with you or not, I'll still respond.
I'm fascinated by the phone number thing. How many calls are you getting a day?
Well, during the legislative session, when it's like, because
You have legislative sessions?
well, with the state. So what kind of happens
okay.
is, our streets or some advocacy group will send a blast out to the people in let's say Senator Rest, who's our state senator's district, and they'll say something like, and I know this is definitely what happens because I get the same calls and emails. It's like, annoy your city council members so that they'll annoy the state senator about this, or things like that. And so right now I've been getting like 3 to 4 calls a day, at least, some days more. But when I first started out, before the sessions really started, I wasn't getting like hardly any calls. So it was just maybe an email once a week or something. But now that the session's going and lots of people want lots of things to happen, I'm another thing on the totem pole to get there.
Is this a 2-year term, a 4-year term?
It's 4 years.
Okay. Do you feel like you're going to run for I know it's early. You're only a couple months in. Are you going to run for another term?
I have absolutely no idea. We'll see how the first year goes.
Okay, I guess it wouldn't be politically correct to say I hate this. I'm probably not coming back. I got 3 years left, but that's going to be it.
Yeah, no, I think it depends a lot on where I am in my personal life and where I am in my professional life, because, you know, this does take a lot of time. It's much more than a hobby. It's definitely a part-time job on top of my full-time job. So,
Yeah. The people who usually run for things like this, where it's the very low pay and like low visibility, are usually very cranky people and not necessarily forward-looking people. These are my words, not Forrest's words, but I think it's important that people run for these lower profile jobs with a positive vision and not just, I'm mad at the world and I want to stop things from happening, which I think these jobs tend to be dominated by people like that.
yeah, I think that's a fair to say, but in Crystal, we're different. I'd say most of the council is not like that.
You have a mayor who voted against a pride resolution.
I said most of the council. No, I mean, while I disagree vehemently with the mayor on pretty much anything socially, he is very professional, and I think that's another nice thing about Crystal as a suburban city versus some of our other suburban cities is we're not yelling. Well, there was one meeting where that was happening, but we're not yelling at each other. We're not, tweeting behind people's backs, or there's not like a lot of flares of emotions. Whereas, I see things that are like happening in Orono or other city councils, and it's like, oh my goodness, I just couldn't imagine going home after a council meeting at 10 p.m. and just like going to bed and going to work the next day.
Are you a former park ranger? Did I read that?
Yes, I am.
And your name is Forrest, and your campaign website has a section called Maintaining a Healthy Forest. Is all this, did you get into trees because your name is Forrest?
Honestly, I would say probably. Yeah. I mean, I worked about 4 years at the DNR in forestry. I love trees, and my name is Forrest. I bet you there's like some conditioning in my mind, hearing my name again and again and again and being like, trees.
Were your parents into trees?
Yeah, I mean, I'm named after the old growth forest in Oregon. My parents are, they're definitely, I think, ex-hippies.
What are we doing about trees in Crystal?
Good question. So I think if my research is correct, Crystal is one of 2 cities in Hennepin County that just absolutely forbids planting trees in the right-of-way or boulevard strip on any city-owned right-of-way. And so when trees die in the boulevard strip, they don't get replanted. It just turns into grass. And with most of our trees here are ash because, most of Minnesota, that's kind of what happened after elm died, is we all planted ash. And so all these ash trees are getting cut down because they're dying from elm ash borer, and then they're not getting replanted with anything. And so what the city says is, well, if you want a tree, we'll give you a tree, but you can plant it on your land. And the setbacks in Crystal are quite large. I mean, they're about 20 feet from the street in most cases. And so it's quite a bit of, it's like, all right, this is the public right-of-way. There used to be a tree here. We were going to cut it down, but if you want a tree, you're going to have to find a place in your yard. And that doesn't always fit every yard, but people still may want a tree. And so that's something that's coming down the line. After we figure out the stop signs, that's the next thing for me is figuring out how to get trees in Crystal.
So I usually ask people at the end if they have any recommendations, and it's not limited to anything in particular. It could be a book, a movie, a place you like to go, something that makes you happy, that you enjoy, that you think other people might be interested in taking up, that would improve their lives. Can you think of anything you can recommend?
Can I think of anything I'd recommend? Well, I would say, and this isn't, I guess it is an endorsement. So Crystal has a hidden gem, and it's a restaurant called Milton's, and I would highly recommend it. It's a great place, and you can get takeout and take it to Bassett Creek Park, which is like a regional park, but nobody knows about it, so it's very unvisited, and it's a great place to have a picnic, watch some birds on Bassett Creek Lake. I think that's what it's called. And it's a great disc golf course there as well. So if you're into disc golf, if you're into food, if you're into parks, it's a great place to be, and I'm there almost every weekend, frolfing or just hanging out with some friends.
Okay, an endorsement for takeout from Milton's and a picnic in the park in Crystal,
Absolutely.
Minnesota. Forrest Eidbo is a city council member in Crystal, Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
This has been the Wedge Live podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards. Thank you for listening.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.